Welcome to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Alexei Navalny, Russia's answer to South Africa's Nelson Mandela, or a rabble rouser and an opportunist vigorously embraced by Western media and governments? Did he get a fair trial that resulted in a prison term? Is he the right person to lead Russia's fragmented political opposition? And importantly, what does the average Russian think of Navalny? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by John Bonar. In London, he's the CEO of BSR Marketing Limited. Also in London, we have Richard Royal. He's chairman of the Westminster Russia Forum. And here in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio with me is Mark Sleboda. He's a senior research lecturer at Moscow State University. Richard, if I can go to you first, before we talk about the implications of Mr. Navalny and Russia's politics, describe to our listeners who exactly he is.
That's a very good question, and one that an awful lot of people have been struggling to answer, actually. In my view, he's nothing but an opportunist. He's a very good, astute politician, but he has changed his political opinions and his views with the wind whenever it has changed. He has flirted with nationalism, some would argue even with neo-Nazism, and now he's trying to, he's become known for his anti-corruption stance, which is all very noble, but he has essentially changed throughout time, essentially. Okay, Richard, I would also say that he's tied anti-corruption with being anti-Putin. I think that's the same lineage right there. Mark, sitting here in the studio with me, you and I look at Western media all the time in Russian politics, and what Richard Royal in London just said is not very often said in Western media when it comes to Mr. Navalny.
Not at all. I think the Western media essentially is salivating all the time, looking for an anti-Putin to support that is in line with their political beliefs. To pretend that the media doesn't have political interests of its own is a little naive, I think. The Western media has strongly liberal ideological beliefs.
So why do they pick Mr. Navalny?
This is the most interesting question. I would characterize it simply out of desperation, looking around at the Russian liberal opposition is a remarkably fringe and radicalized opposition in Russia. It really only represents the views of about 5% of the Russian population. And numerous surveys, polls, elections have shown that again and again and again. And then it's fractured and divided up among various prima donna egoists who can never unify, never cooperate with each other. And to present Navalny, a somewhat newcomer on the scene, as the leader of the Russian opposition all of a sudden, well, none of the other leaders of the Russian various liberal and neoliberal and other assorted groups would characterize Navalny that way. Navalny is very much a radical right-wing extremist. He has strongly ethnic nationalist, racist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and he has views, and he is extremely pro-gun rights. He has suggested that the best way to solve the illegal immigration and ethnic problems in Russia is handing out guns to all of the citizens.
Okay, we got a description of Mr. Navalny. John, if I can go to you. Nonetheless, and we can maybe go into some detail here, we had a trial. He was charged with embezzlement, crime of corruption, and the perception of the trial is that it was not fair, the perception of the verdict that it was not fair, and the perception that he was allowed free again to run in this election seems cynical. That's the point of view in the West. How do you take that?
Well, I think that Mr. Navalny is a prime example that if you're going to set yourself up, and if the Western media and the international literati support such a figure, they should first of all be sure that he's got a clean background. And it's only coming out now and getting some degree of prominence in different commentaries that of Navalny's very mixed background. There's no doubt he's a professional and astute politician. Does he command a leadership? Well, I talk to people across Russia almost on a daily basis. And in the remoter parts of Russia, well outside the Moscow-St. Petersburg axis, people say, who is Navalny? He's nothing. Why are you even thinking about talking about him? And, that's the response I get from ordinary Russians in ordinary towns across Russia.
Richard, but there's obviously the disconnect here. I mean, what Mark was saying, it seems to me, like I said in my introduction, has just been embraced by Western governments. We had the American ambassador, Mike McFaul, come out saying that we, I guess I'm speaking for the American government, are very disappointed with the verdict. I mean, why should Mr. McFaul, the American ambassador to Russia, be concerned with the fate of a Russian citizen in a corruption trial unless the American ambassador had an interest in this particular individual?
Well, I think that we should all be interested in the rule of law in a country such as Russia.
Fair enough.
But I absolutely think that the two other commentators on this program are absolutely spot on in saying that there is a massive disconnect between, of course, what we talk about in the Western media and what basically a bunch of very young, active, politically interested people who protest in Russia are interested in, and of course the rest of Russia, because you go outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and what John says is absolutely right. People don't know who Navalny is. There was a poll conducted not so long ago that said, I think there was 59% of people didn't even know who he was. And even if you look at even the most fair and independent polls at the moment on the Moscow mayoral elections suggest he's got no more than 10 or 15%. The fact is we get very excited about these things in the West, but a lot of people in Russia don't know about people like this and frankly don't care, because what they care about is things like the price of food and being able to put petrol in their car and things like that.
It's very important here. Mark, if I can go to you. Is Mr. Navalny, was he fairly convicted of the charges against him? Let's be clear here, because when looking at Western media, almost none of them wanted to look at Russian law and the case itself. Can you, I know it'll be difficult, can you maybe in a minute and a half encapsulate it for us?
Sure. The case, and it's actually only one of a number of cases that are pending against Navalny for financial and economic wrongdoing, is a clear-cut case of embezzlement and political corruption of the kind that he himself rails against. In his capacity as advisor to the governor of the Kirov region, he basically pressured the state lumber company to rip up its contract and sign a new contract selling its timber at cut-rate prices through a manufactured holding company that was run by a friend, a co-conspirator.
This is very much of a 1990s Yeltsin-era kind of operation.
It's not only a 1990s era. I mean, we see it all over today, but it is precisely the type of corruption that he himself pursues. If you're going to accuse other people of it, you had better be lily white yourself. So he basically pocketed the difference, which amounted up to about $500,000 between him and his other co-conspirators. The case is fairly rock solid. There's 7,000 pages of documents. When the Western media talks about the case, they never talk about the legal particulars because there are numerous witnesses, some of Navalny's own co-conspirators testifying against him.
It's all in Russian as well.
It's all in Russian. There is wiretap recordings. There's an incredible number of documents from their own records. The case is rock solid. But the accusations that are made is that it is unfair to pursue Navalny for this when some other people are not prosecuted for what are often bigger cases of corruption. But again, Navalny entered the national media, the national political scene. And when you enter a national political scene of any country, and this is the United States included, you come under much greater scrutiny from the press, from the opposition. Political research oppositions start digging up all the dirt they can on you, and that includes legal things. And John Edwards' political downfall in the United States shows that exactly.
You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Richard, if I can go back to you, I think Mark was bringing up a very good point here. I mean, when you're in the public realm, I mean, Mr. Navalny made a national name for himself, as much as it could be, with less than 60% of notoriety. I mean, he did put himself in the spotlight. He is a candidate and remains a candidate even after this trial. There is the appeal ahead. I mean, it's not unfair to put this man under a microscope, and he's a politician now. He's an official politician, registered to run for the biggest city in this country. That's fair.
Yeah, it's fair to put him under a microscope, absolutely right. But the problem that we have in Russia is the selective justice and the selective rule of law, which was something that our Foreign Secretary William Hague pointed out. The fact is that most people who are in public life in Russia, who are businessmen or politicians, have the ink of dirty money on their hands. And the problem being that there's only a certain number of people who are prosecuted for it and who are chased down.
But to be fair, I agree with you, because I've lived here through the 1990s to the present, and I've seen a lot of people accumulate huge amounts of money, generate a lot of wealth for themselves. But do we need a 1937 here, Mark?
I want to jump in there for a second. To listen to corruption charges against the Russian government from William Hague and the British military establishment when they were for selective justice, when they were involved in a kickback scheme with the Saudi regime for over $1 billion paid to one of the members of the royal family in order to get a military jet deal through. I find that so cynical and hypocritical.
Yeah, but we can all play, what about this and that.
Sure.
Let's try and talk about Russia only. And the fact is that there is selective rule of law there, unfortunately. Certain people are prosecuted and certain people are allowed to continue their life. And it seems to be that only the people who are politically active and who challenge the political status quo are prosecuted for it.
Well, I'd like to point out here before we move on with Mr. Navalny that on average, year on year, average Russian citizens on a 30% increase year on year go to the courts for justice. So the courts must be working for some people in this country. Political corruption is everywhere in the world. But let's go to John in London. Let's flip this thing. Let's flip this all upside down. I mean, Mr. Navalny is good for Russian politics because it makes people active in politics. It makes people think about politics. If you like Mr. Navalny or not, he is some form of an alternative. I mean, you can take virtue from necessity here and say this kind of invigorates the political process as well.
What the limited numbers of Russians that support Mr. Navalny have possibly exposed. I mean, it's easy to talk about only 10 or 15% of the people polled in Moscow support or would vote for Mr. Navalny as mayor in the coming weeks. But there's something much more fundamental. Mr. Putin came to power on New Year's Eve, 1999, 2000. I remember walking through through Red Square just before midnight that night, and Mr. Yeltsin's speech was being, everybody was excited, amazed, and this virtually unknown man was now in charge of Russia. But since then, we've had a generation of young Russians, educated, literate, internet savvy, who've reached the age of maturity without ever having lived and having any memory of the communist era. They have no recollection of ever living in the Soviet Union. And the chaos of the Yeltsin years is just so much, they've got vague memories from when they were little kids. And now they're mature and they've come along so fast. And it's actually a credit to the Putin policies.
John, but it's an indictment also of opposition politics here. Okay, Richard, I agree with you. With powers that be, they may create an environment. We had a few years ago where the threshold for political parties to be elected to Parliament was up, so it made it more difficult. But they've actually lowered it. Over the last Parliament, they have changed the laws for registration of candidates. Again, the thick description here. If you go to the details, if you want to get into public life, you can do it. It's never good. It's never easy. Why should it be easy? And as Mark pointed out here sitting with me, the opposition doesn't have an agenda that is appealing to the people that John just described.
I think it's a sad indictment, actually, of the situation, the political situation in Russia, that they're looking upon a man like Navalny as their messianic saviour. because, a place like Russia ought to have a lot of very active politicians. You probably see that on the streets in amongst the protest movement. But Navalny is not. I think he's quite a dangerous man, actually, and he is not the man who people should wish as being an alternative to Putin, whatever you think of Putin. But it's a sad situation that there isn't very united opposition, and there aren't other very good candidates.
Mark, I can remember, this was a long time ago, I think it was like in 2002, when Yabloko and SPS, they joined forces to run for the Moscow City Duma. And I can remember talking to the joint candidates, and they had their own press conference, and I asked them a question. I said, well, if you can take control of the City Duma, what's the first thing you're going to do? And they said, we want an investigation into what happened in Chechnya, and we want to investigate this oligarch, and we want to investigate the military. And I said, excuse me, gentlemen, what's your position on schools? What's your position on transportation? What's your position on traffic? Because this is what Muscovites are talking about right now. Mayor Lushkov said that maybe local calls will be charged, but the babushki in the country went on strike. What's your position on that, gentlemen? They had no answer for me.
I think that's exactly right. The liberal opposition, again, only representative of a very small portion of the Russian electorate with their social and political values, has again and again sabotaged itself by not paying attention to what the Russian electorate are concerned about. And the majority of the Russian electorate do remember the 90s. And most of the same leaders of the liberal opposition, the self-proclaimed leaders, many of them were members of government during this time, and the Russian people remember that as a time of economic and social chaos for the country, the equivalent of 3 Great Depressions, where they lost everything. They remember that, and they hold it against them. And Navalny, by associating with these people, with his marches, these protests, running on the neoliberal party Parnas with Nemtsov and the dawn of Russian corruption, Misha 2% Kasyanov, perhaps that's a bit of a reason why that Russians don't take his supposed anti-corruption crusade very seriously, because he's in bed with some of the most corrupt people in Russian politics.
Richard, I used to, by profession, I was an academic historian of Eastern Europe and in Russia. And, when I look at 2013 in Russia, the country I've lived in for 15 years, it's not hard for me to think of 1913, when you had a liberal opposition that was looking to the West for help, looking to the West for ideas, bring democracy to us. Because living here, I feel this amazing disconnect, because when I listen to some of these young people, not so young people with these liberal ideas that Mark described, they're looking to the outside for help, and they're not looking to their own people. And this is a huge problem here, because most Russians don't see that there is an indigenous liberal Russian agenda. And that's rather impoverishing, I think, for the body politic of this country.
You're absolutely right. And as I say, it's a very sad situation that there aren't obvious other candidates and opposition people. But, I mean, it's the thing is with Navalny, he has kind of caught the zeitgeist, and he is very astute in being able to capitalize on the internet and social media in a way that a lot of other Russian politicians haven't. And this is what young people now use, and they can view the Western media, and so it's not unsurprising that they would read Western media and see what we are talking about that is going on in Russia according to our perception, and they take their lead from that.
Richard, if I could stay with you, when we have the election coming up here in Moscow in September, it seems to me, no matter what the result, and I'd like all of you to maybe react to this, it seems to me no matter what the result, the opposition's going to say, fraud, it's unfair, no matter what the result is. Richard first.
This is a very big problem that, again, is, I think, largely of Putin's own making. Problem is that, it's like the boy who cried wolf. The people just don't believe anything that happens anymore, which is problematic. Because I think that...
Give me an example, like the last parliamentary election. Is that what you're alluding to?
Well, no, for example, I think that...
For example?
I think that Putin is probably very popular generally in Russia. But do we talk about that in the West? Not at all.
Why not? Why not? Can you explain to me why not? Is it because of Syria? Or because Russia doesn't follow the rules, it doesn't bend over backwards, it doesn't give up on, it just says, okay, missile defense, have whatever you want. I mean, what is it? I mean, it seems to me that Russia runs its own affairs based on its national interests, but when a country does that, it's either suspect or an enemy.
Well, quite. You've hit the nail on the head, really. It doesn't do what we like. It runs things to its own national interests, which is not to the interests of Britain or America or most Western powers, and that isn't how we like to run the world, because we're in a very, we're still in a very imperialistic mentality, I think.
There's a misperception. Sorry, I'm jumping in here, but there's a misperception that has pervaded the Western thinking on Russia since 1991. In the West, they consider they won the Cold War.
Yeah.
And
yes, exactly.
And as victors, they should dictate the terms under which the defeated Soviet Empire should then follow their rule book for democracy. And I've got to say that I don't think that is valid. I think a lot of people here in the West forget that it took Britain 400 years from the Magna Carta to giving to be able and feel confident enough to give women the right to vote. You know, it's just ludicrous.
You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Mark, we've gotten a little bit away from the electoral part, because I think this is really important, and this is personally what really angers me a lot when the allegations of election fraud and whatnot. There were some improprieties. I think there was no doubt about that. But when we look at the electoral process in this country recently, if we consider the improprieties, would have any of the outcomes been different? Like, for example, President Putin's return to the presidency. If he didn't get those votes, who did?
Okay, your question is an extremely good one, and to answer it shortly, absolutely not. I think the Western media often blanket repeats accusations of the liberal opposition, and let's face it, the Western media is the natural constituency that the liberal opposition speaks to. They blanket repeat accusations of electoral fraud without any serious credibility. And let's take a look at poll numbers. For the sake of poll numbers, particularly let's take a look at Sleboda, what is regarded as the independent, often actually openly pro-liberal polling organization.
But a polling organization that has, I would say, close to universal respect.
It has good respect within Russia, and even more so within the West. Pre-election polling showed that Putin had about 63% support prior to the election. The election showed that he had 64%. The exit polling and the post-election approval rating, all since then, has showed 64%, plus or minus the margin of error. Okay, there's no real question of Putin's support in Russia or of his victory in the election. And while we're taking a look at numbers, let's take a look at some of Navalny's numbers. As was mentioned earlier, when we're taking a look at the prospective mayoral election, Navalny is polling, according to Sleboda, at 8% compared to 78% for Sobyanin. Only 32% of Russians know who Navalny is, despite heavy media coverage in the newspapers and on TV of both the trial and the mayoral race. But of those that have heard of him, 35% don't approve of his political activities compared to 6% that do. And his notoriety has definitely increased. It's even doubled in the last year. But the number of people that say that they would vote for him in a presidential election has gone down from what it was, because the more Russians get to know Navalny and the nationalist and extremist right-wing politics that he really stands for, the less they like him.
Interesting point. Richard, would you like to reply to that?
I think you're absolutely right. The fact is, who reads these things and who actually has access to the news? You know, the people who are protesting on the streets of Moscow and indeed the streets of London about Navalny may well be reading all about what's going on there. But when you go out to outside of Moscow, or even in the suburbs of Moscow, do people really know what he stands for? I'm not even sure he knows what he stands for. And you look at the Western media. I mean, you only have to look at the news reports that have been aired since his prosecution. And all of his history starts in sort of 2010, 2011. He has been a politician or politically active a long time before then, but of course people just seem to forget that and just aren't interested.
John, we're almost out of time here. I mean, when do you think the West will stop picking its leaders for foreign countries? We see this going on in Syria. I don't know, Mark, you might have kept count of the number of people that have been anointed by the United States and NATO countries, and in Syria they keep changing here. And of course we have, again, with the American ambassador, we're basically anointing Mr. Navalny as the true voice of the Russian people. It never works to our interest, does it? It almost always backfires.
It almost certainly does. All you got to do is look at the history of the United States interventions in Iraq and who they first backed as the new leaders of Iraq and who they took advice from, and in fact who they were taking advice from before they actually invaded. And these were discredited Iraqi exiles. One at least had been jailed for corruption with his bank. And
I'm sorry, John, I'm going to have to jump in here. We've only got 30 seconds left. I'm going to give it to my studio guest here, Mark, in Moscow.
Yeah, I'd just like to end on a personal basis. I'm an immigrant to Russia, and Mr. Navalny has extremely anti-immigrant views that he has referred to in derogatory, aggressive terms. As an immigrant, for me and my family, I feel safer with the man behind bars, because I think one of our previous guests was completely correct when he described Navalny as a dangerous man. He's dangerous for the unity of country with his ethnic nationalism and racism, and I feel personally threatened by him, and that's perfectly honest.
All right, gentlemen, because Western media is watching Mr. Navalny, so will we here at Voice of Russia. You've been listening to Debating Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Stay with VOR.